Good morning, my St. Columba's friends and family. Will you pray with me? Loving God, we are grateful that your word is never silent, and we come to you today seeking words of hope, justice, and encouragement. Be in the hearts and homes of all those who worship together today. Amen. About 15 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I lived in Southern California. And right now would be a good time to say that those who are in the state of California and on the West Coast are in all of our thoughts and prayers as you battle and ultimately rebuild from these devastating fires. While I was living on the West Coast, I was taught a really important lesson. An interesting lesson that shockingly my 22-year-old self had not anticipated. Coming as I was from the northern New Jersey, New York City metro area, I was surprised to learn that my sense of humor and my way of talking did not always translate so well to the more laid back, less culturally sarcastic place that I was now residing in. On more than one occasion, I had to apologize or explain that what I said was not to be taken seriously. And then other times I had to apologize because I was serious and I said what I thought, which was not at all what anyone wanted to hear. That experience taught me an invaluable lesson about words, language, and verbal expression. As you have likely experienced in your own lives, even when we may be speaking or hearing a language we know, even if it's our only language, there's always the chance of misunderstanding. This morning, Jesus is telling a parable that displays warmth, humor, and the ridiculous lavishness of God's love. And though we've just heard this story retold in English, a language that many of us are comfortable with, for many hearers this day, I'm imagining that you experienced that story as lacking these same three characteristics. No warmth, no humor, no lavish love. Now, why is that? Because of an accounting issue, of course. You and I are using the wrong math, the wrong numbers when we hear this story, and that simple error leads to gross misunderstanding. Now, I am the furthest thing away from an economist. I thought I knew how numbers worked, and then they introduced cyber currency, and everything I thought I knew about the economy just fell apart. So bear with me because I'm about to talk numbers. We are presented with two numbers in our gospel reading: 10,000 talents and 100 denarii. You, like me, probably took no great notice of the currency, and your brain converted those numbers to dollars. $10,000 versus $100. That's a sizable discrepancy for sure, but both of those numbers are within the realm of possibility, the possibility to possess, to loan out, to owe. So it's fair that we would have considered the comparison as one of apples to apples, but that's just wrong. So we're gonna start with the smaller number. A denarii was 1 day's wages. Let's translate that into today's dollars. And let's assume that they were paid a living wage of $15 an hour for an 8-hour workday. And because this is a hypothetical scenario, let's make it an equitable one. An 8-hour workday at $15 an hour, that's $120 a day. Times that by 100, that's $12,000. So the one enslaved person owed the other enslaved person $12,000, which would have been about a quarter of their yearly wages. So still a very sizable amount of money. I don't want to minimize that. And in case you're wondering, no, I did not take inflation into account. And now to the 10,000 talents. Scholars go back and forth on this one. whether one talent was worth 15 years of wages or 20 years of wages. It was likely that somewhere in between the two is the number. So let's, for argument's sake, go with the smaller number. One talent equaling 15 years of wages. And let's use the same numbers that we had been using earlier. $15 an hour for a 40-hour work week. Well, that's $600 a week. 52 weeks a year with 2 weeks of paid vacation, of course. That's $31,200 a year. That for 15 years, well, that gets us to $468,000 for 15 years of wages. And now we have to multiply that by 10,000. Multiplied by 10,000, that takes us to the ballpark of $4,680,000,000. Yes, my friends, 10,000 talents is $4.68 billion, and that is how much the Lord in this story has loaned to the enslaved man. At this point, you get that Jesus is having a little fun with Peter. There's humor, there's warmth, there's even playfulness woven into this kind of response. Jesus isn't annoyed. Jesus is playing, but Jesus is trying to get Peter and everyone else to think differently. Peter began this whole exchange by essentially asking, what's the limit on forgiveness? A question we ourselves would have no doubt wanted to have asked if we were in the presence of the Holy One. Inherent in this question is the assumption that there has to be a limit to grace. This assumption that grace has to have limits, well, that's a symptom of the human inability to even fathom the abundant and ridiculous generosity of our Creator. Peter here is like so many of us. He's fallen into the scarcity trap. The scarcity trap would have us believe that because we live in a finite world, that there's also a finite, limited amount of goodness and riches within it. This worldview leads to insecurity, and such insecurity breeds rampant competition, sometimes hostility, and the hoarding of privileges and societal advantages. In response to this human assumption about the limits of grace, Jesus proceeds by telling this fantastic, wild story where an enslaved person is loaned and then forgiven a ridiculous, unimaginable, frankly, almost impossible amount of money. Because that's closer to the truth. The question of how many times do I have to forgive? Jesus' parable blows that question wide open by answering it in such a way that it doesn't just answer the question. It offers a different vantage point to view the entirety of the human experience. In Jesus' worldview, the question isn't how many times do I have to forgive my brother or my sister? The question is, how could I not forgive my brother or my sister in light of the forgiveness, grace, and goodness God has bestowed upon me? This is a simple idea, but it's actually world-altering. If we consider all the potential angles of this parable, a different picture comes into view. Someone in possession of $4.68 billion is swimming in money. Our scriptures consistently teach us that you and I were swimming in a sea of forgiveness, acceptance, and love. Currently, we understand forgiveness as something that's scarce, that we have to generate in order to be able to give it. What if we viewed forgiveness differently? As Christians, we're people awake to the fact that we're swimming in God's forgiveness, God's acceptance, and God's love all the time. Do we live this? Do we know this? Do we behave as if this were true? Well, for me, as we're approaching this messy, infuriating final stretch of a presidential campaign, enduring the ongoing pandemic, and as our society continues to be broken into firm and fixed camps where we can't even agree on the problems, let alone the solutions, I need to remember that I am the recipient of 10,000 talents of forgiveness, love, and grace. And as such, that means I need to be sharing of that generosity. I need to forgive more than I want. Jesus today teaches us that God is a generous God, ridiculously generous, but there is a string attached. From that generosity, we are expected to be generous too. That string means letting go of my self-righteousness, of letting go of what I think I'm owed and sharing of the goodness, the grace, the riches of God's blessing with those all around me. This is going to be hard for sure. Good thing God's grace knows no limits. Amen.